Our featured speaker is Rick Sterling. Rick is an investigative journalist based in the San Francisco Bay Area. He's active with the Task Force on the Americas and other organizations, including Syrian Solidarity Movement and Mount Diablo Peace and Justice Center. Rick has researched and written articles challenging the trend towards the corporatization of higher education. He is an active supporter of KPFA listener-sponsored radio and Rossmore Voices for Palestine. Rick was a full-time activist in his early years and took a 25-year detour working as an engineer in electronics and aerospace, primarily at UC Berkeley, and has now returned to work full-time where his heart is, progressive international causes. Rick Sterling.
It's great to be with you today. I'm a longtime friend of Carolyn Scarr and Vivian Zelaya, to name two people, so it's great to be with you. I'm going to be talking about U.S. sanctions. I've got a brief presentation that I'm going to share with you. So I'm going to talk about U.S. sanctions, the impact, the consequences, and some recent developments that are quite interesting. Just on October 18, the Department of Treasury released a review. Actually, on the first day, his first day of office, Joe Biden issued National Security Memorandum 1, which included a call for a review of sanctions and whether they were impeding the global fight against COVID-19. Subsequently, Janet Yellen, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, asked about whether sanctions were diminishing the power of the U.S. dollar, because more and more countries were seeking to get away from the U.S. Dollar domination. And as well, another high official in the Biden administration asked whether sanctions were impacting civilians in targeted countries. So the review was released on October 18, and the establishment response was that U.S. leaders laid down a solid and sensible sanctions policy. This was from the Atlantic Council, the New York Times, and the Washington Post, and other media outlets of representing the U.S. establishment were generally positive about the policy. The policy review was actually a very thin document. It was only 6.5 pages, and it really suggested only minor changes. There was no substantial critique, and interestingly enough, although it was supposed to address the question of whether sanctions were impacting the COVID response, there was no mention of that. The response of the political establishment, the Senate Housing Banking Committee, which has got oversight of the Treasury Department, they had a hearing. They had the Deputy Treasury Secretary Wally Adeyemo hearing before them and testifying, and this was in concert with the unveiling of the sanctions review that they had done. Democratic Senator Menendez was quite aggressive, saying that we need more, not less, sanctions on Russia, China, Ethiopia. The Republicans were the Republican senators were grilling Adeyemo about how China and Iran are evading sanctions, and the only critical voice really was Senator Ossoff from Georgia, and he noted that the report talks about some successes that they've had, but it said nothing about the failures. So obviously, if you're going to do a review of policy, it's a good thing to look at, well, what are the successes and what things are failures, what things have not worked. And he was grilling Adeyemo about why there's no mention of the failures of sanctions. I think the reality is that the establishment is very aware that U.S. sanctions are not very effective in many cases. And so there's one trend, and the Council on Foreign Relations and Foreign Affairs magazine has been quite explicit about saying that there needs to be much less of a go-it-alone attitude and a much more effort to bring Europe and bring other countries into alignment, so that it's not just the U.S. lashing out and sanctioning individuals and countries left and right. A progressive critique of sanctions, as opposed to the one in the Senate and the mainstream media. I was part of a small team that did a 35-page report, which we published in September. And it's titled, "We Don't Deserve This, The Cost and Consequences of U.S. Sanctions." We began this actually in the early spring when we heard news that the Biden administration was going to do a review. So we thought, well, let's do our own review and compare and contrast. So we began in February or March, and then we just completed it, as I said, 5 or 6 weeks ago. Of course, it's got a very different, we identified many problems with sanctions, and our conclusions are, of course, very different. This is the cover page of the report. "We don't deserve this." That is what a woman in Damascus, Syria, said to me when I asked her, "Well, what do you think about sanctions?" I was in Syria in May for their presidential election, and had a lot of chance, visited lots of places, talked with lots of different people, and wherever I went, I asked people, "What do you think of U.S. sanctions?" Which the most extreme sanctions are called the Caesar sanctions, and they were imposed actually in June of 2020, just when the pandemic was sweeping the world. So here it was, the United States dramatically escalating their sanctions on Syria. This here is a photograph. The cover photograph is from Venezuela. They didn't have running water. Why didn't they have running water? Because they didn't have electricity. Why didn't they have electricity? Because the system had been attacked, and because even though it's an oil-producing country, you have to refine the oil to create diesel to run the water pumps and other the other infrastructure. And that has been under extreme sanctions, which, the Trump and Pompeo were talking very much about extreme sanctions. Of course, their main electrical plant for the whole country was sabotaged, and there's some evidence that the U.S. was involved with, had some knowledge or some planning, had something to do with that. The evidence of that being that Marco Rubio knew that had insights about the attack before the energy minister of the country did. So how did he know that before the energy minister of the country did? So in any case, this is a photograph of people lined up to get water. They did not have running water. In fact, a friend of mine was in Caracas, and she said that whenever the water comes on, people rush home and turn on the water and fill up their bathtubs so that they can so that they have a water that way, and they don't have to go and wait in line with a bucket or a barrel. So it's that is extreme. That's not a typical case in Venezuela. They usually do have running water, but this is an extreme example. Sanctions primarily hurt civilians. This is report after report after report indicate that it's not the wealthy that are hurt by sanctions. When the state infrastructure, when the state resources, when they break down, when they are under attack, when the currency of a country is under attack, and the currency is devalued by 10%, 25%, 50%, 80%, 90%. When that happens, it's the poor that are most impacted, and many middle class people are driven into poverty. So when I was in Syria, I was told that even middle class people can only have meat once a month. So the common scenes here, the previous photograph is from Syria. This photograph is from Venezuela. In both cases, they're having to push their car because of gasoline shortages and the huge long lineups, and there's the shortages of essential goods. In Syria, Syria was a country before the war which was tremendously. It had no foreign debt. It was self-sufficient in food. It was self-sufficient in energy. And they had pharmaceutical industry. They did not need to import many of their goods. Then the attacks began in 2011. Basically a gang of countries financed a terrorist war on Nicaragua, somewhat similar to the financing and the organization of the Contras in Nicaragua in the 1980s. But this is what's going on in Venezuela or in Syria today. So when I was there, I saw this man, going through the garbage, looking for some food scraps. One of our findings, we had a variety of findings. One of our findings was that definitely sanctions have hindered the global response to the COVID pandemic. There's a lot of examples of this. Just a few of them are that Cuba, of course, was able to invent and create a vaccine. But they didn't have the syringes, and they had huge difficulty because it turns out there are very few manufacturing plants in the world which are qualified to and which are able to mass produce syringes for use with vaccines. And they had a very hard time getting them. Another example is Venezuela had actually paid their money for the COVAX vaccine arrangement. There was an international arrangement where there would be a supply to countries. It was a kind of an international effort so that underdeveloped countries could receive large shipments of vaccines, but they had to pay the funds. Venezuela paid the funds, but it was blocked by the U.S. They blocked the money transfer. Another example is that in Syria, under the Caesar sanctions, all reconstruction by the government is prohibited. And the U.S. not only does that for U.S. companies, they do it through what they call secondary sanctions, in that if any other country invests money in or supports financially or in engineering technology or in building supplies, equipment supplies, technology transfer, they are under U.S. sanctions. So that a country in the Gulf, for example, United Arab Emirates or some other country, if they wanted to help Syria rebuild hospitals that were damaged in the conflict, they cannot do that and the penalties are really extreme. So obviously, that has severely impacted the ability to respond to COVID in Syria. Pharmaceutical plants as well. As I was saying, Syria used to be largely self-sufficient in pharmaceuticals, except for the most kind of exotic or specialized medicines. But they produced a lot of their own medicines. In the conflict, in the war, the insurgents specifically targeted hospitals, and they specifically targeted manufacturing plants. And now those have to be rebuilt. The country is very largely under the control of the government again, but they can't rebuild because the U.S. So-called Caesar sanctions. Another finding was that sanctions have led to the extraterritorial imprisonment of people. This is another feature which is pretty astounding when you think of it. The U.S. maintaining the right to imprison citizens of other countries for dealing with third-party countries, for example, Meng Wanzhou, the leader of Huawei. I think she was the vice president of Huawei, or maybe she was the chief financial officer of Huawei. She was put under house arrest in Vancouver, Canada, when she was on travel, and held for over 2 years with the U.S. trying to extradite her from Canada. And just a few weeks ago, they finally released her, and she went back to China. But she was under house arrest in Vancouver for 2 full years, with the U.S. Trying to get their clutches on her. There's another important case of a Venezuelan a businessman who was an envoy and as well as a diplomat. He was a Venezuelan envoy who was helping Venezuela arrange for the acquisition of food and medicines and other things that are necessary for Venezuela. And he was traveling on his way to Iran. Iran has been a big supporter of Venezuela. He was on his way to Iran. His plane had to stop for refueling, and they were blocked from stopping in another country, I think in Morocco. They ended up having to land in Cape Verde Island, and which is a very small island nation off the coast of Africa in the Atlantic. And so Alex Saab was in solitary confinement, and he was under arrest in Cape Verde for over a year, while the U.S. again tried to extradite him. All of the legal bodies, there's an organization of West African states, which is comparable to the European Union in that it's an organization that combines several African states, and they have common policies and common rules. Anyway, the court of that association ruled that Cape Verde should release Alex Saab, and he should be paid compensation for his severe punishment. And it was a very blatant example where the U.S. was bribing Cape Verde and offering to invest tens of millions of dollars if they complied with the expectation that they would comply. They stalled and stalled, and then the day before an election happened in Cape Verde just a couple of weeks ago, the day before the election, which elected to power a citizen who would have refused the U.S. request, Alex Saab was kidnapped. He was effectively kidnapped from Cape Verde, and he's in a Florida prison right now. So, and all of this, the point is that this is where sanctions lead. They are extraterritorial claims to extraterritorial rights, so that the U.S. Is filing charges, imprisoning, kidnapping, putting in rendition people. And in this case here, it's especially interesting because there's something called the Vienna Code of Diplomacy, which is a binding treaty, the Vienna Treaty on Diplomacy, that goes back to the 1960s. The U.S. is one of the original signers, and this is a complete violation of that, in that Alex Saab was an ambassador to the African Union. And they have arrested and kidnapped and have him in prison in the U.S. So it's, you have some really extreme cases like this. Another finding, one of our findings, is that many U.S. industries, farm and trade associations are against U.S. sanctions policy. Now, this is from Iowa, this is a big billboard, unilateral sanctions hurting Iowa, hurting U.S. And the organization is called USA Engage. But this is just one example. There's this particular organization, USA Engage, is very articulate and speaks about the need to use diplomacy instead of economic warfare, and making the very strong point that they're hurting. Not only are they hurting the people in targeted countries such as Cuba or Venezuela or Nicaragua or whatever, they're hurting farmers and workers in the U.S. who would like to trade and receive goods and export goods to those countries. So this is another aspect of the policy. Now, some people wonder, well, where do these sanctions come from? Some of the sanctions are enacted into law. The Congress and the Senate passes laws imposing sanctions, but a large number of the sanctions are done by fiat, by the president, and they do it, following a measure which says that it gives the president the authority if there is an emergency or a threat to national security. So, for example, President Obama imposed the sanctions on Venezuela initially by claiming that Venezuela was an emergency and a national security threat to the United States. Well, how ridiculous can you get? Now, the U.S. is truly a threat to Venezuela, but the idea that Venezuela is a threat to the United States is not credible. Venezuela has never taken any military actions. It's never hurt the U.S. economy. Hugo Chavez, had independent ideas and independent policies, but that's not a threat to the national security of the U.S. So, but here we see President Trump signing one of his many measures. President Trump, he was on tap. They just to show you how extreme this is, they imposed 1,000 additional sanctions. And under Biden, unfortunately, that has not been reduced very much. The U.S. is continuing to impose sanctions. Now, one of the most interesting findings in our research was that most of the world, a huge percentage of the world, 70% of the world, condemns the U.S. for this policy. It would be interesting to know how many Americans, or what percentage of Americans, are aware of that. I think it would be extremely low, because it's extremely low because the media never talks about it. For example, at the United Nations, they refer to U.S. sanctions as unilateral coercive measures. They're unilateral because they're not done as part of the United Nations or the UN Security Council. They're unilateral, just imposed by the U.S. or dictated by the U.S. They're coercive measures because they are very much a form of economic coercion, which in many cases is, in the case that I was talking about, of imprisoning individuals, imprisoning diplomats and business people, putting people in prison. How coercive is that? But what's interesting is that the statement, and these statements have been going on for years. This is not just a one-time deal. They've been going on for 10 or 15 years. Very strong statements have been issued by the United Nations General Assembly, and they say explicitly these violate international law, violate international humanitarian law, and they violate the UN Charter. So it's and then about 15 years ago, because of this situation, the United Nations Human Rights Commission mandated the creation of a position, a special rapporteur, that would look into the impact of sanctions. In other words, they tried to determine, well, what are the facts? What's the evidence? Let's have some objective reports. And since that time, there have been 3 special rapporteurs, and they have produced some excellent reports on the impact on the ground. Just last week, maybe it's not even last week. It's just actually it's not just last week. It's 2 days ago. The current special rapporteur on the economic impact of sanctions and the impact of unilateral coercive measures, she issued a report on the impact of sanctions in Zimbabwe. And I haven't had a chance to read that yet, but I'm looking forward to, because her previous reports on Venezuela and Syria were excellent. And yet, if you go to the New York Times and you look in the archives, you can't find a single reference to unilateral coercive measures or Alina Duhan, who is the current special rapporteur. So this is to underscore my point that the media has completely censored discussion of this issue. So that's the Western media is not reported on these realities, and they ignore the UN condemnations and the reports of UN experts. That's just what I've been talking about. How am I doing on time, by the way? I didn't take note of when I started. Okay. Anyway, just a little bit more. On the same point about the United Nations and the world being quite united against this policy, and yet are being completely unaware, ignorant, uninformed, really. The American people are uninformed. So this was the vote in the UN General Assembly this year, just a few months ago, on calling for the U.S. to end the Cuba embargo, and the vote was 184 to 2, and the 2 being the United States and Israel. with 3 abstentions. So, I mean, the irony of this, because we always hear the Biden and we always hear the United States claiming to be the global leader, leading the international community. Why don't other countries follow the rules-based order and so forth? It's the hypocrisy is stunning, and it's nowhere near as stunning, or nowhere near more stunning, at least, than around the issue of sanctions, because the sanctions are being condemned widely, and yet most Americans have no idea of this. Okay, sadly, the situation continues. Since the report, that is the Treasury report, the review of sanctions, it came out on October 18. Since that happened, nothing seems to have changed. The administration has announced increased sanctions on Iran. They've imposed sanctions on Ethiopia. They've threatened sanctions on Nicaragua, prejudging the election that's going to be taking place there next on a week from Sunday, a week from tomorrow. And the Senate has a new bill calling for more sanctions on China. So it looks like as much as the review called for a sharper focus a sharper focus on having a specific goal in mind when imposing a sanction. They talked about having a framework. They talked about calibrating. They had all this nice talk. They talked about modernizing. And of course, they talked about the need for more money and staff. But it looks like it's just more of the same. There does not appear to be any significant change forthcoming. So what to do? Pressure Congress, not Congress. Support the Sanctions Kill Coalition. Keep doing what you're doing. I think this is a general discussion. I guess the first thing is learning what sanctions are and how they hurt people, and then working with others. We need to. One of the things that strikes me as most important is education, and I suspect that a lot of people in Congress, a lot of congressmen and congresswomen are not very well aware of what the impact of sanctions are, and I suspect that a lot of them don't even know about the widespread condemnation, because they read the Washington Post and they read The Hill and PBS and the New York Times, and if it has never been reported there, they probably don't know about it. So as much as I think part of our task is to spread the knowledge, I think we'll put maybe I'll put in the chat the download link, or we can communicate somehow the link for people who are interested to download the report that was produced. So that you can read that if you're interested. The Sanctions Kill has a website. It's called just search on Sanctions Kill, and you'll find the website very easily. And then so I guess I'm going to leave it for now. I'll be happy to take any questions if people are curious. I think we're posting questions in the chat. And I look forward to talking to you more and hearing more. So that's it. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Rick, for your devastating and insightful information.